Hi everyone, welcome. Just wanted to start tonight by acknowledging that we're meeting on Wajak Noongar Budja and pay our respects to elders past and present. Thank you. Tonight's presenter, Arjen Schwarz. Round of applause please. Yep.
I think I'll need that cable again.
Arjen is a fellow AWS Ambassador. For those that don't know, that's a program for people to work with partners, AWS partners, that have sort of demonstrated some degree of technical expertise through their contributions to the community, through presentations or posts or what have you, as well as some level of certification. Our region punches quite above its weight on this program. There's about, I think when I last counted, there was 252 ambassadors. The APAC region has about 125 odd of those, and Perth has 5 of those. So if you'd followed some of my LinkedIn posts recently, you would have seen that I met Arjen along with James and Steve and Elliot, who are here tonight, in Seattle a couple of weeks ago for our global summit. And we mentioned this a couple of times, but if any of you do work for AWS partners and are interested in knowing more about that, have a chat to one of us afterwards. Anyway, the point of that introduction is to say that this man is a legend, although he operates in a community somewhat distant from ours, right? So we're very lucky to have him here tonight. He's come here for this. He's brought his family for a bit of a look-see as well, but yeah, I like to think we lit the spark. Join us. We did sort of take the temperature of the group around EventBridge beforehand, and it's a really mixed bag. So there's a lot of us here who haven't used EventBridge at all. There's a lot of us that have dabbled, we've picked it up but not been able to use it in a production capacity, and some of us that have. Interestingly, I haven't heard there wasn't anything negative in that feedback, but we'll see how we go before the end of the night. So without further ado, Arjen, thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks for that intro, Christian. Hey everyone, as Christian said, my name is Arjen Schwarz. If you're standing at the front, there's still seats available here, by the way, unless you're too scared of me, which I can completely understand.
He doesn't buy it, not hard.
Not hard. So I'll probably be walking back and forth a bit. I'll try not to stand too much in front of the screen so you can actually see what's going on there. I will also have demos. If you have questions or remarks or anything, just shout them out whenever you feel like it. I might ignore them, I might answer them, depending on my mood and whether or not I know the answer. So, just the standards about me. Hi. I'm a principal consultant and AWS Ambassador for CMD Solutions. I also organize this group's counterpart in Melbourne. I've done a bunch of podcasts. I write on my blog, Ignore Me. You'll see that name a lot on the top left of the slide. And I'm a dad. Basically, that means that I don't have much free time anymore these days. But, I still try to dabble in some things. Now, this next slide, apologies, my work paid for me to come here. I'm turning that into a holiday, so at least I think the least I can do is put on a marketing hat. And yep, exactly. I work for CMD. We're an AWS consultancy, premium consultancy. We won Migration Partner and Services Partner of the Year this year. We've got, if you ever decide, just being in Perth is not enough, we've got offices all over the country and New Zealand, some of them in exotic locations like Magnetic Island or Queenstown. A new one is opening up soon in Hobart as well. Basically, we do all the cool stuff. You should come work for us or with us if you're representing a company. We're also part of Mentor Group, and we won best place to work in Australia in 2021 and 2022. So I hope that shows we are awesome. And it's a bunch of my colleagues around here today and on other days, always open to have a chat. But with that, I'll take off this hat and we'll get into actual fun stuff. Cool. So EventBridge basically comes down to event-driven architectures. Does everybody here know what event-driven architectures are? I see some nodding. I see some silence. I'm guessing that means there's a yes and a no, and everybody just wants to see what I've got to say about it. One of the things you often hear about it is in serverless environments. So Lambda, for example, is a very much a event-driven architecture. But if you look at like an official definition, this is the one from Wikipedia. I'm not going to read it out. I'd probably fall half asleep by the time I finish. I don't like these kind of things. So the way I see it is basically you have a trigger. Oh, sorry. What is an event? You have a trigger and you get a response to that. And a trigger can really be anything. So there's no limits to how you would define a trigger. So let's take a real world example. Some of you may be familiar with this example I'm going to give. 6 Aussies walk into a Seattle bar. That is a trigger. The event that happens, as you expect, there's an exchange of money and drinks, and everybody's happy. Then we've got a follow-up event. 6 more Aussies join this group. Now, a guess from those who were not there, what is the result? Is it going to be the same? Or is it they all get kicked out because the bar for some reason has a group limit of 6 people? And you've got a group of confused people standing outside wondering why nobody wants their money. Those are events, triggers and responses. Now, if we go back to a more traditional IT-based thing, the one event we're all familiar with is this one. You may not always want to read these, but this is the standard cron syntax. At this time of day, this needs to happen. Whether that means you run an application, a script, you shut down all your servers because it's after business hours. This is, in my opinion, often the prototypical event that you get. So let's call that as what is an event. And I already mentioned this example as well. In fact, you can see here that AWS even uses the same nomenclature I did, and Lambda has triggers. In this case, the example happens to be EventBridge. Purely coincidence, nothing to do with the topic of this talk. Basically, though, just trigger and response is not always enough. Often you want something in between to manage a trigger and go to a response. If we look at a PubSub model, like Kafka or Kinesis or things like that, you will see often more these terms: producer, manager, consumer. Basically, the idea is you've got a bunch of things that produce triggers, something that ensures that whatever happens, that those triggers end up in the right spot without the system needing to know about it, and consumers that consume from those managers. In PubSub, this is usually a polling mechanism, whereas EventBridge, which we'll be talking about, is purely push. So nothing is polling from EventBridge, it all pushes. So we'll just keep with the idea of triggers, responses, and how that works. Then let's actually dive into EventBridge instead of just random blathering about the high-level stuff. This is the architecture diagram that AWS provides for EventBridge. There's a lot of stuff here, but basically you can see 3 groups. There is the group on the left, which provide the triggers. There's the thing in the middle, which is EventBridge, which is basically the manager part. And then at the end, you've got the parts that take care of the responses. So that is where your messages go to and what triggers what gets done. Now, I know that's, sorry. Some of you are definitely aware of this, but EventBridge basically grew out of a different AWS service named CloudWatch Events. These days, if you go to CloudWatch Events, you get to see this. A nice message from AWS asking why the hell you're still trying to access this page when you shouldn't, when they've got this fun new service that you should be using instead. Sure. I kind of agree with that statement, although I don't know why they don't just do a redirect. But that's high level what EventBridge is. Usually, when I learn about something, I learn by doing. So that's why a lot of what I'll be doing is showing demos of how you can use a service like this. So this example here is something I built a couple of years ago for a client. I won't name the client, and trust me, the demo has been altered so that anything actually related to that is not identifiable. But we all have, this client in particular, and it's a common situation, had a situation where they wanted security tooling to be installed on every instance that got spun up. So you say, let's build it all into the AMIs. That's great. But what if somebody doesn't use those AMIs? They still wanted it to be there. So basically the idea here was that when an EC2 instance is installed, we check if the security tools are running. If they are running, that's great. We'll add a tag, all good. If they're not running, we'll make them run. If that succeeds, all good again. If it doesn't, we'll add a fail tag, and it becomes somebody else's problem. So this can easily be done just by using EventBridge. So one of the many triggers that EventBridge is, and that I'll start talking about here, is basically most AWS services, or maybe not most, but a lot of AWS services send triggers to EventBridge. This doesn't cost you anything, whether you use it or not. It's all happening under the hood. So when an EC2 instance gets launched, when it stops, when something happens with RDS, Dynamo, many options that you have, it triggers. It sends something to EventBridge, and you can set up a rule to then handle that. No, not that one. So let me show you how that actually works in practice. How readable is that? I want that. Let me just. Let's just zoom in a bit. So, in this case, I've got here an event pattern set up. Literally, all it does is when a so-called EC2 state change notification comes through. And yes, these detail type names are always long, always annoying, and you have to have them exactly correct. Fun times, and I hope just always copy paste them from the documentation or whatever, because you don't want to deal with debugging for hours just to find out you misspelled something. Now, let's quickly start an instance and see what happens. So just give it a name. I will give it a T3 micro instance because I disagree with the notion that T2s should still be around. I don't use a key pair because that's what we've got Session Manager for. I have already a security group from a launch wizard created in the past. And I choose GP3 for the same reason I chose a T3. If there was anybody at AWS here, I would say these defaults might not be a bad thing to get updated. But I'm sure you all agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. So I've now launched this instance. While that's going on, let's have a quick look at exactly what it does. So we've set up this event pattern, which, as all things AWS, shows at JSON, because I suspect somebody at AWS thinks that that is a readable language. And what it does, in essence, is trigger a system manager automation. If you're not familiar with it, system manager automations are basically, let's say, documents that you can run against your instances or even other things, and it will do things. So in this case, it will, over here, so in this case, what it will do is it will check if things are present, and if not, it will install it for us.
We just lost your audio.
It should be back now? Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. So it will install these tools. In this case, it just uses one of my open source projects because that is easy for demos. So it pulls that in, but well, actually, so it first checks, is it already running? If not, it pulls it in and installs it. It's just a Go binary, so there's nothing really exciting about it. And it's not something you would usually want to install on an instance, but it works again for a demo. So, all good. Now, let's go back here to the instance. And we see that it doesn't have anything yet. Can anybody tell me why? Cool. It is because I wasn't very smart and forgot to add an IAM profile. Because Systems Manager needs certain permissions. So what we do is we add that permission, conveniently all prepared, and then we go back to the slide and pretend that this was all a master plan from me, because I wanted to talk about the archive functionality. So what you can do with EventBridge is usually EventBridge, it gets a message, it sends the message to whatever you've subscribed it to, and it's gone. But you can enable archives. And these archives, basically, it will not just go to your targets, but it will also be stored in the archive, and you can replay that message afterwards. So instead of just losing everything, you can run it again. So in this demo, that is very convenient because I can still show that things work. But also, especially if you're doing development or things like that, what it helps with is, I've made it, if you made a change to the way you want to process messages, you can just reprocess all of these messages, which is really nice, and therefore we are going to do that. I'll show first, if we look at the members, let's look at the archive. So I set up an EC2 archive. Basically, I filtered everything from source AWS EC2 gets saved into this archive. I also had set to, I think, a retention of a single day. So in this case, it might not be great for development work, but it saves on my costs. Not that it's expensive, but I tend to sometimes forget to clean up stuff after demos. But what I can do now, we can go back to the instance and see if it happens to have gotten anything else. It actually says installed for some reason. That is not what it should have. That is because I was too quick and it did retries just from the automation. Doesn't matter. We're still going to run the demo. So I'll put down the microphone again for a moment. Basically, I'll just run this. You can see the source is the EC2 archive, and we want to run it to the default bus. That's also the only option because you can't, I haven't spoken yet about other buses. I'll come to that in a moment. But basically, you can only replay events to the same event bus. We can select whether or not we want to run these events against all the rules or just specific ones. So if I just say specific ones, just do it to this one. Then I say today, what time is it? 6. Let's say anything from 6 to 7. And let me just remove this tag so that you can actually see that. Why did that not show up there? Oh. So then we start the replay. And we can even follow along here in the executions. Oh, so basically it takes a minute or so for this to show up. We're not going to wait for that. I'll just continue with the slides so you don't have to stand here looking at me or sit there looking at me waiting for something to finish. It doesn't usually take more than a couple minutes, and that is quite enough in most situations. But yes, we already did that. Basically, when you replay, it does the exact same message with one difference. It adds the replay name. So the replay name is the name I just gave to the replay I send. So the messages that system manager would have received has the replay name in there. This is useful if you want to add any filters on replayed messages. So, for example, if there's something that you know 100% certain you never want to have to deal with replayed messages, set in a filter that it doesn't handle any incoming requests with the replay name, which is good. Let's see if that was enough time. So the replay itself has completed now. And even here, the task itself completed too. So that means, once again, our little instance should have a tag. And the demo worked. Amazing. Woo! Cool. So that's one thing here. Let's move on, because it's fun that we can play around with anything from AWS itself. But there's other things. As I said, we've got here a whole bunch of items from EventBridge. And here, AWS Services is just a single one of these. So how about we look at SaaS apps in this case? Technically speaking, the one I chose, I'm not 100% certain. If you call it a SaaS app, I think it is, but people might differ. So I'm going the route of the underwear norms. I want to push something to GitHub, do something with it, and be happy. I'll be honest. Originally, I planned for this demo to push things to GitHub and then use a Lambda function to clone that basically every single push into code commit. I couldn't get that working. I'm sorry. I failed all of you. I appreciate the comment. But I've got another one that I can show you. One of the ways you can set it up, in this case, for GitHub and some other services, I think it's Twilio and Stripe, AWS released quick starts that will basically spin up a Lambda function with a function URL. A function URL, if you didn't see that before, is a relatively new feature from Lambda where you can actually have a URL directly for your Lambda function instead of having to put an API gateway or anything else in front of it, which is really cool. So they use this, and for that they spin up a CloudFormation template. So I did this in my demo account, and that template has hard-coded 10 concurrent, a limit of 10 concurrent calls. AWS has a default quota of 1,000, of which you can use 10. So that was kind of a bummer. So I went through the usual increased quota. 2 days later, my quota was increased, not to the 200 that I asked for, that apparently needed some approval from a service team, but to the 1,000 that is the actual default. Don't ask me why. I did not bother responding to the support tickets because I was actually in an airplane and things like that. That said, after that it worked. Well, technically I had it working before then because I just removed the hard-coded limit from the CloudFormation template. Oh, yep. I'm actually going to demo doing stuff in the console, which don't do this at home. Just write everything as infrastructure as code because friends don't let friends use the console. So what we'll be doing is quickly set up this quick start, which is actually not hard. So we'll say setup. Actually, you know what? Let's create a new event bus. So you can create custom event buses where you basically, and again, I'll just put this down and talk a little bit loud. If you can't hear me, let me know. If you couldn't hear that message, well, it's too bad. Perf bus. Not going to bother with the archive or other things. You can provide all kinds of IAM policies. I'm actually not going to go into the security details of EventBridge today. There's a bunch of things I couldn't cover just time-wise, and this is one of them. So created a perf bus. Now I'll say get started. We'll do this. Reload. Oh. There. Then we'll create, yes, that's all fine. I'll need to put in a very secret. Click all the buttons that you need to do for CloudFormation, and I'll create a stack. So this is going to take about 80 seconds. So in the meantime, obviously, what we'll do is just go back to the slides while we wait for that. Because one thing I will be using here is what's called an input transformer. This basically lets you receive the message, then you can define so-called input paths, where you say, okay, author is basically detail.name. Then you define a template where you say, in this syntax, author push to commit, which then gets sent to the target as author Arjen push to commit, which is really handy and allows you to tweak your messages quite a bit from if you don't use them. So, for example, if you were to look at a full GitHub message, that is a lot of JSON, and I don't want that in my demo. So I'm going to use an input transformer to make it all look a bit better. Now, with a bit of luck, we have now reached the point where that hook has been created. So we'll go here. We've got this output value there. And I will quickly set up a webhook here. And of course it needs extra security. Please don't copy this one-time password. So we paste here the URL that we just got. Obviously, as I mentioned before, everything is JSON, so make sure you set it to JSON, and then fill in the secret that we just so carefully put secretly here in plain text. There you can select all the usual stuff that you do with webhooks in GitHub. Not really relevant, but we just need a push event. So we'll add the webhook. And that's all set up now. Let's just make sure if we refresh that it has a nice tick. Cool. Then we look at our code. Nope. First, obviously, we need to set up a rule. So let's do that here. We've got the new bus mentioned, so put it in there. GitHub thingy, because let's stay professional. We want an event pattern, all that stuff, and it's just standard event source. When you create, so this is actually quite nice, you can just say, okay, this is what an event looks like. So here we can see, okay, this is, as I said, there's a lot of JSON that usually gets sent by GitHub. This is all demo values, but it sends all of this, which is way more than we need. So here you see all the partners that are standard. You can also, I don't have a demo for it, but you can have your own things. You can use it with your own APIs. It has features like schema discovery that help with that. I'll talk about it a little bit later on, but I'm conscious of the time as well. So basically we have this pattern that we can use. We can also change it, and then we can just go a bit more in detail and say, okay, I really only care about messages that come from this specific repository. Useful if you have something like this set up for multiple things, or just want filters for various reasons. So this is similar to the filter I had set up earlier for these two instances, but then for a different detail values. You can test that the pattern matches. It doesn't match because the test pattern has XYZ as the repository name. If we were to change that, then it would be nice and green. I tested that. Cool. Then we want to add a target. So in this case, we're just going to send it to an SNS topic that will then send an email to me and be all good. You see here, you can also add additional targets. So you don't have to limit it to just the one place. Just send it to a bunch of different places. And then under additional settings, we get to the good bits. So do we want to send the whole message, part of the message, just a random bit of JSON, or are we going to use an input transformer? As you may expect from the fact that I just talked about it, we're going to use an input transformer. So again here, you can see all of this that will basically tell you exactly how things, what you will receive and how it works. Here you also have a bit of detail that tells you how to provide the input paths and templates and what it then turns into, which is unsurprisingly similar to what I'll be doing now. So let me just make sure I've got the name right, repository name. Detail dot. And author will I believe it was that, which I have to say it's not a great name, but I will be your pusher tonight. In that case, we can then see author pushed a commit to name, which I could have called repo, but forgot to do. You can generate the output here at the bottom, so you can actually see that it works. Again, these are demo values, so secretly this actually works. We could also just make it the name slightly cleaner, and instead of name, we'll just call it full name, which I think is with an underscore in there. Well, yep, correct. So again, we generate the output. We press confirm. Don't really care about the rest at the moment. And we just say yes, 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 create. Now we've got this rule created. I will add a file. Do the standard hello world commit. And this has been committed now. We could look here in the EventBridge at the monitoring when it shows up. But like other monitoring services, there can always be a slight delay. So instead, we will look here, and we see that Arjen Schwarz pushed a commit to his repo. And no comments about the amount of unread emails, please. So, all working. Cool. Let's just, yeah, we know that. Thank you. So I've got one last demo basically here. And that is for another project I did. And some of you have seen some of this. Basically, CloudFormation. Does anybody here not know what CloudFormation is? Cool. A CDK uses CloudFormation under the hood, which makes it a more readable, or depending on the language, less readable version. It basically allows you to do fancy stuff that you may not want to do all the time. But the important thing, aside from, again, I'm going to be not nice here to AWS, their news posts are not always greatly titled. But a couple months ago, CloudFormation got event notifications. So anything that CloudFormation does goes to EventBridge. Well, I say anything, but it's 3 different events. CloudFormation stack status change, resource status change, and drift detection status change. We're only going to look at the top one here right now for this, but that's all fun already. Keep in mind, by the way, if you do want to do anything with resource status change, That's a lot of messages. If you've got any amount of CloudFormation templates, that means you get an update, you get a message when it gets created, when it is finished creating, when it updates, when it roll back. You're probably familiar with all the different types that you can get. So we're going to just do the exact same thing here that we did with other things. Basically, it's all the same idea. I didn't go into the details earlier, but the source of an event pattern is either an AWS service, an external service, your own service, whatever it is. And the detail type is then the specific call. So with GitHub, that was a push. With AWS services, that is a long string with spaces in it that you can't make mistakes in. The filters, again, the same thing that I mentioned before. All of these filters, so the way these filters work as well is, this means for any of these options. You can just have it filtered to one option. You still need to put it in an array when you put those filters in. You can see that here as well with the detail type and the source. Technically speaking, you can have multiple sources, multiple detail types in a single rule. Whether that is manageable for you might be a different case, but there could be use cases where this is something that would work for you. So basically, CloudFormation sends to EventBridge, and that then does other stuff. I actually forgot what this icon stands for. I think it's just an EventBridge message or something like that. Why do I care? All the usual stuff. We all know CloudFormation is not fast, but we don't always want to hear it. And having data this way we can collect data about it and things like that. Specifically, a project I wrote early in the year before this came out was something called fog reports. What that does is basically it gives you a summary of a deployment, puts a pretty graph in it, and that gives you insight into what you built. So for this demo, or rather for a similar demo I gave the times before, I decided to hook this up to EventBridge, which basically means that when I deploy a CloudFormation template, it goes to EventBridge, it goes to Lambda. Lambda then contains the generation for fog reports, and it can save it to S3, which is great. That means you have a central place for your CloudFormation deployments, all the logging, all that stuff. But because I'm me, and probably like some other of you, I need to keep tinkering. So I decided we can make this multi-account. It's not hard. We'll just have everything sent to that S3 bucket, which is great, but it can be more fun. We then have that S3 bucket send another event that then triggers a Lambda, that triggers Amplify, which pulls website code from a code commit repo and basically builds a website. So then you get a website like this, where you can see all of the deployments that you've done in your various accounts. So this one is live. I would suggest don't have a public website for your CloudFormation deployments in general, unless you're doing a demo, in which case it's perfectly fine. At this stage, I could just deploy a new CloudFormation stack to show you what that would look like. But I don't actually have to because we just deployed one 10 minutes ago, which shows that it's working. So here we can see the deployment we did earlier, which is the kind of thing that to me shows the power of a service like EventBridge. Yes, I don't know how useful this is for people. I find it very cool, but that could also just be a me thing. But wait, there's more. We're reaching the end of the talk because I'm pretty much out of time. So I'm not going to go into deep details about any of these. Schemas. So everything that I mentioned with the sources is all handled with schemas. You can define your own schemas. Like I said, AWS has their own, which are the ones I talked about. There was the one from GitHub. They all have their own. But you can build these schemas for your own services as well. On top of that, you can turn on what is called auto-discovery, where basically EventBridge will create these schemas for you, save them as OpenAPI free format, and you can just say, okay, these are the schemas I'm using, which is really good for development. And if you're worried about costs for that, I think the first 5 million or so are free, and after that it's $1 per million. So it's not going to break the bank, unless you're a really, really, really fast developer. Obviously, it has cross-account and region functionality, so you can send things back and forth. All good. More interesting there, though, is probably the global endpoints. And the global endpoints allow you to have event bridges in different regions, and they get talked to from one. You point your applications or your services, GitHub, at that global endpoint, and it will pick the specific, whichever region makes the most sense. Usually one that's actually working, but it could also be like the closest or things like that. Pro tip, don't make those rules and stuff very different from each other. That might not have the effects you want. API destinations is fairly new. Basically, I showed you how you can all integrate it with all the AWS services, which is really cool. API destinations now let you basically send it to any HTTP endpoint. So you could, for example, have, if you use the early example of GitHub, you can send a push notification to EventBridge, and EventBridge then sends that to your Jira or whatever third-party thing, SaaS solution or an on-prem service or anything like that. So you're not tied to AWS services anymore. Obviously, you could already do stuff like that by just putting a Lambda in between. But if you don't need to run the Lambda, that's always better. And that brings me to the end. As always, I like to think of my talks as a way to give people ideas. What can I do with this? So in that regard, consider the possibilities for where would this work for you? What can I do? What can you do with it to make your life that little bit easier? Because that's all we want. We love playing with stuff, but mostly we just want to make our lives easier so that we can play with the really cool stuff. With that, thank you. This is places where you can find me based on notifications I got. Some of you also discovered that LinkedIn is probably very similar to those bottom two. So thank you, and I'm here for any questions. Any questions?
Hi.
Yeah.
So, if we were going to use, you've got SQS SNS, which I guess
So-
provides a limited set of features that you get from EventBridge. In terms of things like cost and throughput, if we ignore, say, like Firefox, how does EventBridge compare? I guess you've got the cross-region stuff. I'm guessing if you've got global endpoints and you're sending messages across regions, you pay for that cross-region transfer as well?
So there's a bit of a difference in the approach, I'd say, with like an SQS. And obviously you can use both of them intertwined, and you can have messages from EventBridge go to SQS. I'm pretty sure it can be done the other way around. One major difference between them is what I've mentioned before, which is push versus pull. So EventBridge pushes, whereas you need to pull your SQS queues. Cost-wise, I'm not 100% certain, mostly because they're both not super expensive. Again, with EventBridge, messages that you receive, costs are about $1 per 1 million, which is not a great amount. Data-wise, that means you can have bigger messages. Limits are 64 kilobytes. And once you go over that amount, it just charges for 2 messages. I don't know actually what the limit size is because I haven't had that much JSON that I sent at one point. I recommend keeping it that way. So I can't really tell you which would be cheaper. But I don't think there's a major difference and it really just depends on what works better for you.
So if EventBridge is pushed and you've got these subscribers that get invoked sort of near time, synchronously once the message that they subscribe to arrives,
Yep.
the purpose of the archive, is that in case one of those subscribers for some reason isn't working or isn't able to process something, or so you can after the event add subscribers to messages that are
Yeah, the archive is not specifically meant for like that letter queue type stuff. You can have, pretty sure you can have that letter queues here as well. But the archive is really mostly for the replay functionality. So, as I said, say you make changes to the way things work, or yes, you want to send messages somewhere else as well. You forgot to add something where they also need to go. For that kind of thing, it's useful. I suspect in most cases, the archive is mostly useful at the beginning of a development cycle. And once you have it all completely figured out, you might still want to have it enabled, but for a shorter time, just the usual in case something breaks on a Friday afternoon and nobody notices it until Monday morning. Cool. Yeah.
The API endpoint, there's a new functionality because actually the AWS services, it can invoke Lambda and it will spin up or it can put a message onto the SQS, right? And
Yeah.
it's 99.99% availability. With the API endpoints, let's say it's the third-party API, and let's say the API is down, right? And when it hits the API endpoint, the API fails. So what will happen with that message? It's going to persist it, or that message is completely lost?
Depends if you've got archive turned on.
Yeah. It basically depends on the archive. It basically disappears, and that is then actually, I didn't think of it, but that's another good case for having archive.
And DLQ. So
And, yeah.
you'll retry 3 times over configurable amount of time, and then it'll DLQ if you configure DLQ.
So we can use archival for a direct queuing type of.
It's in addition to. You can set up that letter queue, and I didn't include it in the demo, but yes.
If you're doing something like event sourcing or something like that, and you want to, replay it into like a different view of your data or something like that, like it seems like it only provides you the opportunity to replay it to the same targets that you've already set.
No, you can replay it to other rules, but you can only replay it to rules in the same bus.
Right. So can you create rules that, like, say for example, you modify your existing rules to exclude replays from a specific replay tag or something like that, so that, say for example, you want to build a new view over your data that you don't want your existing view to be changed, you can replay it on that same bus, but then use a different rule to build in a different location?
Yes.
Yeah, right, okay.
Yeah, you can select the rules that
Yeah.
that replay.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
So you just have that target. So,
Cool.
With the schemas, is there any possibility to use those schemas for validation, or is just for the purpose of discovery? So validation means like if the message is coming and you don't want to push the garbage to target system, and you just want to stop it there if it doesn't get validated against the schema.
No, basically, see EventBridge a bit as message broker. It just passes through what it has, what it gets. The only validation you can do is on the filters. So, but those are inclusive and not exclusive. So you can't say if this is, well, if I get garbage here, don't send it. You can only say, okay, if it is correct data, then please pass it through. Yeah.
does it support Avro schemas or only OpenAPI?
As far as I know, it's only OpenAPI.
Are there any patterns for dealing with an event-driven application that needs to integrate with one of the AWS services that doesn't have EventBridge integration?
General patterns, yes, no. One thing you could always do there is send it to a Lambda or step function, and so Lambda can always invoke anything, of course, if you give it things. Step functions is basically integrated with every service, so you could also send it there and have that pick it up. Those are the main ones I would usually think of for the integration as a pattern that you can use. Otherwise, I'd say it depends on the service. Yep.
You mentioned at the beginning to talk about Kafka and other methods, right? My concern is more about all of the demo was about AWS infrastructure and how you have different instances talking to each other and triggering each other's. But if I'm building my own system in different microservices that I want to have some messages about business roles and things that happened within my architecture, I think the first question to ask is, would EventBridge be a good solution for that? Where I have something happening in my business application that triggers the event, and then I give microservices, all custom in a way.
Yeah, so it can do all of that. Seeing probably your follow-up question on that, is it a full replacement for something like Kafka? I suspect if it was, we wouldn't have managed Kafka in AWS.
Yeah, okay. I think you killed my second question now.
Cool, yeah.
What do you think about the sort of buses with a lot of logic that are a bit monolithic, kind of become a bit of a taboo, and there's a bit of movement around dump pipes and smart endpoints, I guess, from Martin Fowler, and the idea of managing kind of fairly complex configuration within a bus like this philosophically. Do you have any views on that?
So usually I'd say keep things like this simple. Really use it as a way to decide where things go. Transformers are useful, so the input transformers, as I showed, they're useful to massage the data a little bit, just so that you don't get inundated with all the things you don't necessarily need. But don't try to put too much logic in here, because that means that when something goes wrong, you'll debug the source, the EventBridge or other service you use for it, and your consumer. And being able to at least rule out one of those should save you time. So in general, I like to keep, generally speaking, we're all familiar with microservices. Let's make things do the least amount possible. We also all know that that doesn't always work. It's still a good goal to strive for, in my opinion, just to make things easier. Anything else? Anyone else? Cool. I think that's it then.
Fantastic. Round of applause.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Arjen. Really appreciate it. We're getting on. We're sort of running a little bit later than we normally do, so we'll keep it fairly short. Just give you an idea of what we're looking at for the rest of the year as we come in. We're working on two pretty special things for November, but we can't really say what because we're waiting to figure out which one's going to fall first. I don't know when we'll know, but it'll be before the session's due. That's planned. And actually, we were looking to squeeze another event in before Christmas in December as well. So earlier in the year, we weren't necessarily planning on that. At this stage, it's looking like an IoT session. So more details as we get some, validate that a little more. So that'll be a combination of some more technical demonstration around the IoT services, plus a customer case study. And I know that went down really well when we had the Greek Commission people out a couple of months ago. In the meantime, please let us know if there's something else that you want to hear about. I know we say it every month, but we mean it, and we'll try and get it on the backlog. And if anybody's interested, there was a community summit in September, one of the reasons why we did our group. And I'm happy to do a bit of a lightning talk around that at some point, just to let you know what groups around the world are doing, because it's crazy. So that could be a bit of fun, but if you're interested, let us know online.
Just on that, that's an awesome idea around the lightning talk, but we wanted to make sure that people know if you would like to do like a supporting act lightning talk before the main talk, let us know. Because we want to get people up and having a go as well, and even if it's something really small that you've been working on or would like to share. So lightning talks are welcome.
Yeah, I know we've been tending to favour the kind of hour-long type format, but we are somewhat flexible. We're pretty flexible around that. It's just we haven't had a full complement of shorter talks to do, but really happy to do it if you know that. Any questions? Cool. Thanks very much, everyone.